Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Hello and welcome to News Laundry Interviews. I have with me today from his hometown of Bangalore, Ramachandra Guha. Hi, Mr. Guha.
Hi. Just a clarification. I'm actually in Kunur in the Nilgiris and I've been here for the last 6 weeks.
Oh, you have? Okay. So what did you preempt the lockdown and you?
Yeah. So I am a senior citizen with an asthmatic condition. So my family packed me off to a quiet place, and so I've been here for the last few weeks.
But do you consider Bangalore your hometown? Do you consider Dehradun?
Yeah. Well, I consider Bangalore and Dehradun my hometowns because I was born and raised in Dehradun. So I'm one of these odd people, a divided self, a confused guy, a Nehruvian Indian who doesn't know where he's from, whether he's from North India, South India, Uttarakhand or Karnataka. I think both.
Okay. So I'm sure our audience don't need any introduction, but those of you who may be just coming out of school, Mr. Guha is one of our most well-known historians, India's most well-known historians, a prolific writer, a columnist, and I often have said that his book India After Gandhi should be prescribed in school syllabus because when I was studying ICSC, in fact, me and Mr. Guha went to the same school. Of course, I went a few years after him. History ended after we got independence. And unfortunately, I think what our generation or any Indian needs most of is how India was kept together, which I think your book does brilliantly. It's a difficult job because so much to cover in one book. So, has it been prescribed anywhere as a syllabus?
No,
India After Gandhi.
In fact, I got a mail today from a friend who teaches in Assam saying it's been prescribed for the class 12 syllabus. I think for the ISC. I'm not sure elsewhere, but it's widely read. I'm delighted that young people are reading it. When I wrote the book, many people advised me, don't make it too fat. This is the age of social media, sound bites. But I found I couldn't tell the story in less than 900 pages. And I think
Right.
of course, you can teach chunks of it. You can teach the chapter on the elections, on the making of the constitution, on the China war. So it is, I think, taught quite widely. And more than that, I think what makes me very happy is that it has come in many Indian languages. It's appeared in Malayalam, Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, and translated by very good people, by outstanding translators.
So I'll come back to that book and I want to go into a little deeper into that and the history of India. But first I have two slightly more frivolous questions to ask you. One is
Sure.
when you were protesting against CAA and that video of yours being rounded up by the cops went viral and it led to much outrage and much needed a spotlight on the subject. What happened after that? Where did they take you? Can you tell me what the experience with the cops was?
It was fine because I think they very expertly put me into the van, but they forgot to take my mobile phone. So there was a message immediately from Nidhi Razdan, in fact, saying the cops have got you because the camera person Nihal Kidwai who shot it was from the NDTV, and of course I was speaking in Hindi. Now my Hindi is, you are from the Doon school. You, I think, have decent Hindi. My Hindi is only marginally better than Rahul Gandhi's, who also went to our school. But I was speaking in Hindi, so it was captured. आप देखिए, हम बिल्कुल हिंसा पूर्वक हैं. आप देखिए, शांति से हम यहाँ खड़े हैं. So I think that's what attracted attention. That this old man speaking Hindi, उसको उठा के ले गए हैं. But the cops were quite civil. And when I reached, ironically, when I reached the detention center, there was a very fine lady cop, whom I should not name, who saw me and recognized me because she had read India After Gandhi to get through the civil services examination. So we were there for a few hours. And Karnataka, Abhinandan, you see, India varies enormously in how its states are run, in the severity or otherwise of the police. Had this been Srinagar or Lucknow, I would have been brutalized. But in Karnataka are very gentle. G.R. Vishwanath, Rahul Dravid, वो सीधे साधे लोग हैं. So I was fortunate. In fact, I told my wife in the morning, I said, there's a possibility I'll be detained, but don't worry, because this is not the UP or the J&K police.
Right. So you were in the vehicle for you'd say a few minutes, then you were in the detention center for a couple of hours, and then you went home.
We were in the vehicle for more than an hour. We drove round and round, and then we were taken to actually a wedding hall, a Kalyan Mandapam, which the police in Bangalore uses our wedding season for this kind of stuff. And we were there for several hours. And the nice thing, I was joined by many people, young people, middle-aged people, activists, students, law students, doctors, lawyers. And we were there for several hours. And then I think I was picked up at about 10:45 and left at about 5 p.m.
Okay. Someone came to pick you up, or were you dropped home? Like, did you find a bus, an auto? Like, how do you get home?
No, I called a lawyer came and to represent different people, and the lawyer called my wife, and then my wife came to pick me up. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is the recent, controversy regarding the column of yours where you called out the Central Vista project for the indulgence it is.
Yes.
Has this happened often in your career that you've written about something and it's not okay? You've been writing for a long time.
Yes.
Were you as high profile a columnist during, the earlier days of the Congress, or were you much younger and you weren't the celebrated historian then? I mean, the same, I'm not trying to do a whataboutery balance, but how often have you faced stuff like this?
So first I'll ask you your second question. Because I'm well known, normally I would have more leeway than an unknown person, right? Because, but that's the second part of it. So actually, being well known should give one more leeway, but perhaps it no longer does. The first part of the question, Abhinandan, is that, I've been writing for newspapers for many years, and occasionally they pushed back and I fought hard at them. And I must say the Telegraph, for whom I've written now for 20 years, has never remotely interfered with what I've said. And my longest running column is with the Telegraph. And it may be, the Telegraph has given complete independence. I've even criticized the newspaper in its columns. I've criticized the proprietor of the newspaper for certain things he or she may have done. And when the Hindustan Times asked me to write, very briefly, in 2008, the Hindustan Times offered me a monthly column. I was running it every month. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister. At one stage, the person handling the column had gone to Calcutta to cover the West Bengal elections. I had criticized Manmohan Singh, and the management was currying favor with the Congress government and dropped that paragraph. So I stopped the column in 2011 for that. 2 years later, then the editor of the Hindustan Times, Sanjay Narayan, no longer the editor, solicited a meeting with me, said, we'd like you to resume your column fortnightly this time. And he said, I give you my assurance, nothing will be changed without your permission. So there's a history to this. Now, of course, Mr. Narayan honored the agreement, but he left a little later. In the last few months, I've had occasional problems. For example, this will be relevant to news laundry. I wrote a column in December about what is colloquially known as Godi media. I don't know who. Godi media was just mentioned in passing. I said, Republic TV and Times Now and Aaj Tak and Zee News spread poison. That was changed to some channels stress poison. So on Twitter I went and I said, unless those names are put back, I will stop my column. The names were put back. This is December, as recently as 3 or 4 months ago. Now this time I was told that, I've said in the preface to what I said in the Wire. So there's a history to this. This time, last time, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was Manmohan Singh. This time it was Narendra Modi. So I think it's deeply distressing when a prestigious newspaper like the Hindustan Times, once associated with Mahatma Gandhi in the freedom movement, would be so scared. But I think younger columnists, less well-known columnists are more scared. What will happen now that they've dropped me is that there'll be self-censorship or pre-censorship. The people still writing columns in the Hindustan Times will be careful about what they say, how they say it, whom they name, whom they do not name.
Right.
So I felt I had to make a public statement because of this history, that I had been given that assurance that nothing would be changed and I would not be censored.
Right. And if you could just enlighten me and our listeners and viewers also about Mahatma Gandhi's association with the Hindustan Times.
So the Hindustan Times was, of course, started, I forget by whom, but it was shortly after it was started in 1924. It was bought by G.D. Birla, who was a capitalist, and a philanthropist very close to Gandhi. And they were consistently in support of the freedom movement. And beyond that political affiliation, they had a personal affiliation in that Gandhi's youngest son, Devdas, edited the Hindustan Times from the 1930s to the 1950s. For example, the children of Devdas Gandhi, who include Rajmohan Gandhi and Gopal Krishna Gandhi, grew up as it turns out in Hanuman Road in Delhi in a Hindustan Times flat. But so they had that background, but in recent decades, I suppose, things change. I mean, I understand that this is a vindictive government. They can withdraw advertisement. I understand that newspaper proprietors have interest in other businesses which might be affected. But at the same time, this was the betrayal of a solemn assurance given to me by the paper. So I had to withdraw and I had to make it public.
I see. So now I'd like to touch upon, your books, your writing, history per se, how it is covered, how it is interpreted. Now, I mean, I don't know who's credited with this. Maybe you would know that, journalism is the first draft of history. Now with journalism in the disarray.
Rough first draft of history. Rough first draft.
Rough first draft. Okay.
Rough first draft of history. Yeah.
So now in the situation journalism is in, like we are truly in a post-truth world. And, I'm sure you've been on several panels and conferences on fake news. I know I have, every other week there's something and you learn something new about how it is being used as a propaganda tool, both by the state and by corporations and by political parties or what have you. Where does that leave history? Historians such as you, now, when you were, for example, writing India After Gandhi, first of all, I must tell our listeners, I highly recommend that book. I think it's lying somewhere here on my bookshelf. I'll just pull it out because it tells you what a challenge it was keeping India together. It wasn't just independence, mil gaya, chalo tali bajao, ya diye jalao, whatever was the equivalent at that time. It was a challenge keeping it together because there were, interests in the Northeast, the tribes, they refused to be a part of this big monolithic India. There was, the South did not want this Hindi dominance. So it's a fantastic book that really makes you realize stuff that you take for granted and you did not even know. At least I didn't know much of it. That Nehru was the first one to, send the Air Force against his own people. So when you wrote that book, what are the sources that a historian like you has to delve into when you write something like that? And where does today's news leave us for a Ramachandra Guha 50 years later?
Correct. So I'll answer that question, but first, just a couple of clarifications on what you just said. It was actually Indira Gandhi and not Nehru who first used the Air Force on her own people against the Mizos in 1966. The second and more important remark is that I was also discovering this afresh, Abhinandan, not just you, the reader, while reading my book, but while writing the book, because I too had studied history, which ended in 1947. So the research was completely new to me. All the nuances, the details, the characters, the controversies, much of it was totally new to me. So perhaps the book conveys some of my own discovery and my own excitement at finding out all these things. I think that's part of why maybe, people want to it. Now, I had to use a wide variety of sources: government records, private correspondence, legal records, parliamentary debates, secondary books, memoirs, war histories, but also a lot of newspapers. And this brings me back to your first question about journalism as the rough draft of history. Journalists cover things in great detail. But of course, a historian has to judge. For example, after I wrote India After Gandhi, I wrote a biography of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, when you're dealing with the Salt March, I looked at the British-owned papers like the Times of India covering the Salt March, full of disparaging comments, saying it's not important, there's not much of a crowd. And of course, on the other side, there were nationalist newspapers like the Bombay Chronicle, which were exultantly glorifying Gandhi's role. So newspapers provide basic information. They provide eyewitness accounts as they happened and unfolded. But still, you can't take them absolutely at face value. You may have to read, for example, if you're writing about the Dravidian movement, if you can read Tamil, it's good if you read a Tamil newspaper as well as a Hindi newspaper. So you have to, a historian's job is to sift different perspectives. Of course, a historian is not writing fiction. What a historian does is not fiction, but it's not mathematics either. You can't prove it in the way you can prove a mathematical equation or a physical equation. So it's interpretation, it's understanding, it's argument. History is like a craft. So like a weaver, someone who makes a carpet with many different ingredients and colors and designs and motifs. The longer you're at it, the better you get at it. So at 20, you're not such a good carpet maker. At 30, you're slightly better. At 40, you're even better. But by the time you're 50 or 60 of my age, you're waning. So I think a historian's best period, because you're old and your limbs are not so supple. In the case of a historian, his mind is not so alert. So I think the best time for a historian is in their 40s and 50s, because you're not callow and inexperienced, and you're not too set in your ways or, burdened with illness or ill health either. And I think I was lucky in that I wrote India After Gandhi in my 40s. I researched it in my 40s, by which time I'd already written several books on more specialized topics. I'd written a history of environmentalism, a history of Uttarakhand, a history of cricket, a biography of the anthropologist Verrier Elvin. I'd written more focused themes, and I think I was ready enough when I was 40 to take on this large canvas history.
Right.
So I couldn't have done it at 30. I'd have been too naive and innocent. At 50 or 60, I'd have been too old and too tired. So perhaps, so I think maybe I was just lucky that I was asked to write this book when I was absolutely prepared, and I had the energy to trawl through old newspaper microfilms and go to archives all around the world to discover new material.
So, Mr. Guha, from the time, your generation of historians would look at probably files or microfilms or newspapers. I'm sure future historians will look at drives full of footage or newscasts or the electronic media or even the internet. Now, how are we to assume that your sources would be more credible and more high in quality of journalism than today's sources?
So I think it's, as I said, in my case, there was very little video footage. So if I was writing about the insurgency in Kashmir in 1890, why the insurgency began, the expulsion of the Pandits, the repression by the state, there's no video footage. I had to look at newspapers and reports by civil liberties organizations and so on. If someone was doing a history of the 2016 upsurge in Kashmir, they would have social media footage, maybe reports by journalists, Srinagar-based journalists, what they're saying in Urdu or in English. And the closer you get to the action, the more reliable you are likely to be. So, for example, if a historian wants to write about the 1980s Assam agitation, it's better to read a Guwahati paper than a Delhi paper. It's better to read a Assamese paper in Guwahati than an English paper from Guwahati. Like today, a historian 30 years later writing about, shall we say, the Anna Hazare movement or something else, where there's video footage. Please don't listen. You'll get nothing from Arnab Goswami's talk shows because it's all in the studio. You only get bullshit and anger and screaming.
So you have to look at footage, not the commentary of news.
Live footage as close to the action as possible. Right. Anna Hazare's speeches, tweets, videos, reports. So that even then, so you have to get as close to the action as possible. The sources you're using must be as close to the action, as bottom up, as grounded as possible. And even then they'd be biased because human beings are biased. Human beings are selective even when they want to be honest. They think they're not honest. They think they're not biased. They're still biased.
So now it was a challenge keeping India together, and that has ably come forward in your book. Now I wanted to touch upon three key figures during this interview, and I'm wondering if we can kind of demonstrate, is there a problem? Is there a genuine criticism, even though the way it's taken up and the people who've taken up that criticism may be half literate or may not, the criticism may not be coming from an intellectual honesty, but more from an ideological dogmatism. Has our history been too kind to Nehru and Bapu?
So let me speak about Nehru. In his lifetime, Nehru was venerated excessively. After his lifetime, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, Nehru has been denigrated excessively. So his reputation when he was alive probably did him more than justice. His posthumous reputation does him less than justice. He was an extraordinary man who contributed enormously to our freedom movement, to our nurturing of our democracy, to our plural and secular traditions. He had great failures. He had a blind spot about private enterprise. He should have focused much more on primary health and education. He stayed on too long in power. He should have retired after 2 terms in 1958. So he was a complex figure with great achievements and some substantial failures. But particularly the last 10 or 15 years, he's been demonized excessively. And this is for 2 reasons. One is, of course, the rise of the Hindu right, which hated him even when he was alive, which saw him as a westernized Indian who was betraying the kind of authentic Swadeshi soul of the people. But the other reason he's been demonized is for no fault of his own. It's the deeds of his successors. Abhinandan, there's a statement of my mentor, the great Indian sociologist Andre Bete, which I like quoting, and I'd like to quote again for your viewers. Andre Bete said that in the Bible it is remarked, the sins of the father are visited on 7 successive generations. In the case of Nehru, the biblical injunction has been reversed, and the sins of 7 successive generations have been retrospectively visited on him. So,
in fact, you said this you were the chief guest at the Doon School Founders Day.
Yes.
And you said this, and I was there because that was our 25th year, and I was there and sitting in the Rose Bowl, and Priyanka was there because it was son was in school. And I thought that was a little harsh on the boy to hear the chief guest say that on stage. And I was wondering, if the Hindu right would say that Guha said this at the school in front of the Gandhis. But yeah.
I didn't know the Gandhis were there, but I would have said it anyway. Yeah. So I think that's really he was an extraordinary figure. I think, you see, if you believe without Nehru, there would have been no multi-party democracy based on universal adult franchise. If the RSS had taken over in 1947 and 1950, they opposed universal adult franchise. The organizer in 1952 said, this is a farce and nonsense, right? If you had not had Ambedkar and Nehru, Hindu women would have not got equal rights. So there are many things we owe to Nehru. On the other hand, I think he should have focused much more on primary health and education. I think he should have nurtured a successor. Gandhi nurtured him as his successor. Gandhi nurtured him and Patel, and he did not leave anyone behind. He stayed on, he thought perhaps he was immortal or indispensable. But he was an extraordinary but flawed figure, not the great, colossal figure he was presented when he was alive, and by no means the demon that the Hindu right makes him out.
If we were to have an honest critique of our figures, historical figures, it would have to come from people who are read and not, let's say, I forget the gentleman's name, I've interviewed him, who was appointed in Haryana as a consultant also, who said that...
Dinanath Batra.
Yes, Dinanath Batra. I mean, now the point is that when intellectuals, leave the field open for criticism, then that is occupied by people who have, whose criticism is, is plucked out of wherever.
Correct.
So, do you think someone like you or people of your caliber should have been a little more critical of Nehru at your prime or at their prime?
Perhaps. I think there was an aura about him when he was alive. Too many people were seduced by his charm, his intelligence, his humanity, his personality. And there were some criticisms. The great statesman Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, who was with him and then left and founded the Swatantra Party, it's probably true. He got too kind a pass when he was alive. It's also true that when Indira Gandhi was in power, the kind of historians she patronized were, gave Patel no credit. Nehru, this is very important. Nehru and Patel were a partnership. They were a jugalbandi. They were working together. They had disagreements, but they set aside those disagreements to work together, both during the freedom movement and between 1947 and 1950. And, just to give you a personal anecdote, in 2007, when Narendra Modi was running for re-election in Gujarat, the Congress was in power. Sonia Gandhi went to Gujarat to campaign for the Congress party and announced said that if the Congress comes to power, we'll have a new rural insurance scheme. But it should be named after Patel, who was a congressman. Excuse me. Narendra Modi had not discovered Patel in 2007. But she named it Rajiv Gandhi Insurance Scheme. What the hell did Rajiv Gandhi have to do Gujarat, right? Now, when Nehru was alive, he had a kind of aura, a glow, a charisma, which captivated intellectuals and writers, and I think they gave him too easy a pass. After his death, I think the fact that his family has so shamelessly misused his name and his legacy has contributed to this demonization. And I'll give you one example, which is to do with Nehru and Patel. Contrary to what is bruited about now, Nehru and Patel were colleagues, team workers, who were shoulder to shoulder in the freedom movement and worked together to build a democratic united India. Of course, there are disagreements, as husband and wife, brother and sister do, but they set aside those disagreements in the larger national and democratic interest. Now, the reason the BJP was able to own Patel is that the Congress disowned him. Indira Gandhi never named anything after him. Sonia Gandhi, while campaigning for the Gujarat election in 2007, said she's going to have a new rural insurance scheme, health insurance scheme. The sensible thing would have been to name it after Patel, a great Gujarati and a great congressman. And in 2007, Narendra Modi had more or less not heard of, had certainly not appropriated Sardar Patel. Now the BJP and its ancestors, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, barely participated in the freedom movement. They wanted an icon from that time. The Congress had discarded their great leader Patel, so they picked up Patel. And of course, that is an unconscionable tragedy that Patel was thrown away by the Congress party which he built, and by the descendants of Nehru, who was Patel's great colleague and friend and comrade.
Okay, so now other than Nehru, what about Bapu? I guess he's, deified even more. He's like an untouchable for the longest time. I remember, in fact, when I started writing this political satire for NDT with these, marionettes, these puppets, I wrote that from 2003, 2010. The only thing I was told was you can't make fun of the flag, you can't make fun of the president of India, and you can't make fun of Bapu Gandhi because that apparently is against the law. Is it? I said, I didn't even know. So, I mean, you can't use his image. So is there some valid criticism of Bapu that also should have been there, so it does not get taken over as a hate campaign, but rather as an informed critique of a man who was flawed? For example, I saw this wonderful documentary, and I would advise our listeners also, viewers also, to watch it. It's called Rasulan. It was made by this lady. It was screened at Habitat on Rasulan Bai, and on the Bai culture of Banaras. And I didn't know, during the independence movement, even all the Bais of Banaras, they collected money to give. And he said, we will not take money from you because you are of loose morals and you make money using, and Bapu refused their help, which was tragic, but he was such a prude. But go ahead, some criticism of Bapu that should come.
Sure. So first of all, I think the person in NDTV was misinformed or out of date, because criticisms of Gandhi are rampant. In fact, he's the only person in India whom you can criticize freely in any way and not have your show or your film or your book banned. If you criticize Nehru, then the Congress will get after you. If you criticize Savarkar, the BJP will get after you. If you criticize Ambedkar, the Ambedkarites will get after you, and so on. If you criticize Bose, the Bengalis will excommunicate you. Right. So there's actually open season on Gandhi. So I think your producer was excessively nervous. Yes, there are many criticisms to be made of him. One is that he was excessively prudish in matters of sexuality. I mean, I've seen that documentary on Rasulan Bai. I think it's made by Sabah Diwan. It's a gorgeous document. It's a gorgeous documentary. I have Rasulan Bai on my iPod, and I listen to Amaj Khamaj all the time. I mean, I'm a great fan of Rasulan Bai, Siddheshwari, and Gandhi, unlike Tagore, did not have an aesthetic sense and didn't understand that kind of complex. He was harsh on his wife, obnoxious to his, particularly his two older sons, one of whom he drove to drink and destitution. And like many great public figures, for example, great artists, great scientists, he was an awful family man. He also made political mistakes. I think there's a major debate on whether the Khilafat movement actually hindered rather than helped Hindu-Muslim harmony. He was certainly very ambitious, wanted to retain control of the Congress party, which is why he and Subhash Bose fell out. But beyond all of that, he was a colossal figure. I think there are 3 or 4 aspects of Gandhi's thought that are perennial relevance, not just to India, but to the world. The first is nonviolence. If you want to seek freedom from oppression, do so through collective satyagraha, not through picking up the gun. I mean, maybe if in 1952-53, people in Nagaland had not picked up the gun, they would have got their rights quicker and faster, because Gandhi recognized the state will be more brutal than you. They have more firepower. They will oppress you, and it will be the villagers in between who will be squeezed and suffer. I mean, that's true of the Naxalites in central India. But then you have the Naxalites, you have the army and the CRPF, and you have the Adivasi in between, squeezed and suppressed. So nonviolence is not only morally wiser, but more likely to succeed in ending injustice, as the example of the civil rights movement in America shows. Secondly, Hindu-Muslim harmony. That interfaith harmony is what India will survive on, and equal respect for people of all faiths and all languages, not just all faiths. Thirdly, the abolition of untouchability. And fourthly, economic self-reliance and environmental sustainability. I mean, in a post-COVID world, Gandhi's extraordinary prescience on environmental matters, which I've written about elsewhere, will come back. I mean, he understood that, of course, you need to eliminate poverty, you need education, health for everyone, but you need to be responsible and restrained in your attitude towards nature. So there are many aspects of his philosophy which are of perennial relevance, despite his very human flaws.
But wouldn't you say that his ahimsa or the satyagraha works when you're operating in a society or in a context or in a time period where there is an acknowledgement of a morally higher ground? You are taking the morally higher ground, right?
Yeah.
But there has to be an acknowledgement of the morally higher ground. Like, I personally feel that an overwhelming, and I won't say this is true for all of India, but from what I hear of my reporter friends, journalist friends, what's happening on the ground in UP, like in UP, Corona is a Muslim bimari. I mean, it's worked. The polarization has worked. It worked during election when that whole Kenar, episode happened. So there are certain pockets where there is no morally, there is no acknowledgement of morally higher ground. Just like when you have people, the Arnabs of the world, calling for the arrest or endorsing shutting down journalists. For example, there are journalists I know who I have known for years who were happily, talking about journalistic freedom during the UPA time. But now that they have turned and they are the ass kissers of the present government, the same journalists who I have known throughout my life as decent people will endorse shutting down a journalist, will endorse shutting down a news organization. Right. So I'm wondering, is there an acknowledgement of a morally higher ground? So is Bapu relevant?
No. So you're absolutely right. So if you look at his own lifetime, the British were, you could embarrass and shame them. They were harsh and oppressive rulers, but not absolutely brutal and draconian. Non-violence would not have worked for the Jews against Hitler, for example. Gandhi thought it might, but he was spectacularly wrong. It may or may not have worked against the French, who were much more harsh and oppressive as colonial rulers than the British were. For example, there's a story, it's a lovely story, of Ho Chi Minh, the great Vietnamese leader, coming to Delhi in 1957 after Vietnam had won its independence. Before it was bombed by the Americans, but after it won independence from the French. And he came to Delhi and he went to Rajghat, and he's supposed to have said, if Mahatma Gandhi had been fighting the French, he would have given up non-violence within a week. All right. Now, so you're right. I mean, there may be conditions in which there's such an unfeeling, cold, dehumanized ruler or oppressor that non-violence won't work. But in a democracy, I think, like even in a flawed or partial democracy like India, I mean, if you contrast what the Naxalites have tried to do with the Dravidian movement, which was able to keep Hindi out largely through non-violence. I mean, they didn't go and they burnt post offices where there were Hindi signs. They defaced those signs. But they didn't go violently against the state.
In fact, in your book, there's this reference of I'm terrible with names who fasted to death for the Andhra.
Potti Sriramulu, right? So he fasted to death. He was actually a follower of Gandhi, and he stayed in the Sevagram ashram for several years. So for an Andhra state, he didn't pick up a gun and go and blow the hell out of Nehru and his cabinet, right? So I think even in a partial, clearly in a totally oppressive, brutalized state. I mean, if you look at the tragic plight of the Dalai Lama, against the Chinese, the Tibetans are squashed. But in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in the 80s and 90s, if you look at solidarity and how it contributed to the end of communism in Poland, because the Polish communist rulers were not like Mao or like Hitler. So you're right, that there are certain historical conditions where maybe Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence are completely impracticable. But I think in India, even today, in most of India, I think conditions exist where principled collective nonviolence can shame the authorities, provided you're prepared to suffer yourself, that you fast, you go to jail, you can experience humiliation and so on. I have no sympathy. I have never had any sympathy for the Naxalites because of their cult of violence. They should have done what the CPM or the CPI has done and fought elections. I mean, look at what's happened in Kerala, for example, where the left has promoted their egalitarian ideas through the elections. So I think, likewise, to me, the Hindutva extremists and religious extremists, whether Islamic or Hindu, on the one side, or Sikh like in Khalistan, and the Naxalites are on the same page. I mean, unlike many other so-called liberal intellectuals, I have not a single ounce of sympathy or romance with the Naxalites, because they defeat the cause for which they claim they are fighting.
Okay, now before I wind up with two soft questions which are a little lighter, one more historical character that I would like to discuss with you, and maybe like I personally have read about him. I was ironically given a book by him. He works for India, Uday Mahurkar. I think he heads the Gujarat with India Today. He's one of the senior editors. When I was working in News Track, I had gone there to cover an election, and he was shocked that I didn't know who Veer Savarkar was or didn't know enough about him. So he gifted me a book, saying that you should read this because you have grown up on Gandhi and Nehru. And I think that book was supposed to make me look at Savarkar as, in a complimentary way. But I was shocked at the kind of things he said. Now, he has been demonized, I guess, or ignored, and now his thing is being put up in parliament. Now, like other characters, he's also a great character. I mean, he did undergo, 10 years, almost a decade of, Kala Pani, and liberals mock him for having apologized, whereas, people would apologize for a lot less. Like if you were, Arundhati apologized when she was arrested, much as I appreciate her writing. So he's also, made fun of for trivial reasons, while there may be major reasons to make fun of him. At the same time, is he also a character who had some heroism in him, which was never acknowledged by the liberal thinkers of your time?
So, first of all, I completely agree with you that the fact that he wrote a clemency petition after a decade in the harshest prison conditions should absolutely not be held against him. I never would, and I never do. Savarkar is a fascinating character. There's an early phase to his life where he is brave, idealistic, and promotes Hindu-Muslim harmony. At that stage, Gandhi and he are both promoting Hindu-Muslim harmony, but Savarkar is promoting violence and Gandhi is promoting non-violence. And in fact, Hind Swaraj, Gandhi's famous text, which is a debate between a reader and an editor, was written just after a major debate he had with Savarkar in London in 1909, on the occasion of Dasara, in fact. So that's the early Savarkar. Then he's jailed shortly after that exchange with Gandhi. And what happens in jail is two things. One, he becomes anti-Muslim. And secondly, he becomes someone who will not even use non-violence to get the British out, but will collaborate with them. So in 1909, when Gandhi and Savarkar met in London, in India House in London, both were, in fact, Savarkar was more anti-colonial than Gandhi. Gandhi was a bit of a British loyalist. He only wanted greater rights for Indians to non-violence. By the 1920s, Gandhi wanted Purna Swaraj, full independence, and Savarkar was willing to collaborate with the British. And he had become bitterly anti-Muslim. Now, but yet there's a very interesting side to him. You see, Savarkar was actually a considerable scholar and an intellectual. Unlike Golwalkar, the main leader of the RSS, whose writings I've read very closely, and who really was an ordinary bigot of the Organizer magazine type. Usme kuch nahi hai. Nothing of subtlety, nuance, just hatred and bigotry, nothing else. And that's why all the BJP leaders who have read his works and the RSS leaders being on Golwalkar have this kind of black and white, very crude understanding of India and of religion. Savarkar had a very complex mind.
Okay.
He was a writer. He wrote beautiful patriotic songs which are still sung in Maharashtra. He was very opposed to caste discrimination, but he was a very bitter man also at the same time, consumed with hatred and rivalry for Gandhi. And I'll give you one illustration in the last years of his life. In 1944, Kasturba Gandhi died in jail. I mean, she died in prison. She had been to prison many times before, but she died in prison. And some of Gandhi's admirers started a fund in Kasturba Gandhi's name. And Savarkar, who was then president of the Hindu Mahasabha, issued a diktat, a fatwa to all his followers: do not contribute a paisa in Kasturba Gandhi's memory. So he had a kind of all-consuming hatred of Gandhi. And there is no question that he was Godse's mentor. There's juries out on whether he had any kind of role in the assassination. But from Godse's letters and writings, it's clear that Savarkar was his mentor. So he was a very complex figure, again, a nuanced figure, without
What
doubt.
do you think happened? Do you think the 10 years in prison made him
We don't know. We don't know. There are all kinds of theories, about, it's not very clear, but that's what happened. And this kind of very pernicious loyalty test that Muslims are subjected to, Savarkar invented, Muslims and Christians. Savarkar coined this distinction between an Indian's Pitra Bhumi and his or her Punya Bhumi. So for a Hindu or a Sikh, your Pitra Bhumi is India, and so is your Punya Bhumi, because it's the Golden Temple or Mathura or the Tanjavur, right? But for a Muslim or a Christian, your Pitra Bhumi may be India, but your Punya Bhumi is Mecca or Rome, so you are forever suspect, and you have at every turn you have to prove your loyalty and your devotion to Mother India and sing Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata Ki Jai. So that pernicious loyalty test was invented by Savarkar. And I think, so he was a very complex figure. Again, he was not part of the RSS, but the BJP appropriated Patel because they had no one from the freedom struggle. They never participated in the freedom struggle. They appropriated Savarkar because he's actually much more subtle and sophisticated than Golwalkar. They're embarrassed about Golwalkar. So Savarkar was a scholar, a writer. He wrote plays, he wrote poetry, he wrote some major historical works, including one on the 1857 rebellion, which he called the First War of Indian Independence, which is all about Hindu-Muslim harmony in fighting the British. That was his book on 1857. So a fascinating, complex figure, without doubt, and by no means, as black as some liberals or leftists would say.
Okay. Now, finally, you have, it was fantastic conversation. Always a pleasure to learn so much when one speaks to you. I'll, wind this up, but you've written a lot about cricket and you're a cricket shauqeen. I mean, you've been a player as well. And so, I mean, people who are regular listeners to our podcasts will get the reference. So I won't bother explaining it to you unless you want to know. Do you think cricket is a sport or a game? And a person who's so well-read and educated as yourself, how do you distinguish between a sport and a game, and what is cricket?
I think it's more a sport than a game.
Okay.
I think it's the most subtle and sophisticated sport or game ever invented by human beings.
Really?
But yes, without doubt. And I'm clear on that. Well, particularly Test cricket. One of the analogies I'm particularly proud of is where I compared Test cricket to single malt whiskey, 50-50 cricket to Indian-made foreign liquor, and 20-20 to the local thara which you get down the road. Right now, so Test cricket is like single malt. You can remember the aroma, the texture, the smell, what the first day was like, a great innings, a comeback spell, a rearguard action, a defensive innings. Right, 50-50, you sort of, if someone, like when Tendulkar scored that great 90 against Pakistan in South Africa in, I think, 2003, you can remember the strokes. But 20-20, all you remember is I got smashed. Maza aaya or bas ho gaya, right? So that's my kind of analogy, right? So for an addict, if you can't get your single malt or your old monk, the thara will do. The thara will do, right? So, but I am an unabashed partisan of Test cricket. I am also an unabashed partisan of bowlers over batsmen. In my view, it may sound heretical to say so, Anil Kumble won more Test matches for India than Sachin Tendulkar. Because to win a Test match, you have to get 20 wickets, not score 1,000 runs, right? So I'm a partisan of bowlers. I'm a partisan of Test cricket. I'm a partisan of Karnataka, my state team. I don't care if India wins or loses, but, KL Rahul must get 100. KL Rahul must get 100. Right? So that's the kind of, and all cricket fans are like this. I have been arguing for 30 years with Rajdeep Sardesai about Bombay versus Karnataka. And he once wrote, many years ago, almost 30 years ago now, I wrote my first book on cricket, which is called Wickets in the East. And Rajdeep reviewed it. Rajdeep was then an unknown journalist. One of the first jobs he got at the Times of India was to review my book. And he wrote in the review, it's a nice book, very lots of good stories and so on. But he said, Guha's excessive love for Karnataka cricketers may cause another Kaveri dispute. Now, so I think I loved it. Rajdeep thought he's insulting me, but I loved it. I thought it's a great compliment. So I think that kind of cricket evokes those kinds of passions and emotions which are unexpected. I honestly, I prefer. I'm not disconsolate if India loses, but if Karnataka loses to Bombay, then I can't sleep that night.
Okay, now before you go, the times we live in, how do you think history will remember these times? I mean, even COVID, I mean, the world has changed in ways dramatically, not just for political reasons, but for scientific reasons, biological reasons. What are the big significant impact? How will this impact history in your view, if you were to crystal ball gaze?
So I'd go back to what you said earlier in our conversation, Abhinandan, that journalism is the first rough draft, the rough first draft of history. So this, COVID is a huge challenge to journalism. The authoritarian rule of Narendra Modi is a huge challenge to journalism, to cover it fairly, objectively, thoroughly, deeply.
And both together
but what would be the larger consequences? You need 20 or 30 years to judge. I believe, like you said some very nice things about India after Gandhi. Now, I believe that, and I say this with all sincerity, the first parts of India after Gandhi, written in about the 40s and 50s, are more credible than the parts about the 60s and the 70s. And the closer you get to the present, it's more journalism and less history. So the reader reading what I'm writing about the 2014 elections in the second edition of India after Gandhi should be slightly more skeptical about what I say than the chapter on the first election in 1952. So to write subtle, nuanced, balanced history, you need distance and probably 20 or 30 years. So clearly, Narendra Modi's regime is the most authoritarian since Indira Gandhi's in the 1970s. Will it be worse or about the same? We can't say yet. Clearly, COVID is the greatest threat India has faced to its social fabric since the Second World War or partition. Will it be comparable with the Spanish flu in its devastation? We can't really say. But these are complex, difficult times. And the politics of today, the devastation that COVID is going to cause, economic and social and cultural and moral, will be with us. The scars of all of this will be with us for a very long time.
Although I will say the comparison between Indira and Narendra Modi, I'd say he is more, authoritarian, or this regime is worse. And I say that not because in absolute terms, but I think democracy is its time is baked into that cake of that measurement, or it should be, because what is considered a democratic right in the 80s? For example, during Gandhi's time, South Africa was an acceptable country to have. Today, you can't have a law like that and still be considered civilized. So the right to information was something that most countries would not want in the 70s. Today, there'll be very few countries. So I think if in 2020, we are comparing a leader to the 70s, for me, he's already failed.
Let me push back on that. All right. Now, I certainly think Narendra Modi is more dangerous as a person than Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was redeemed by several things: her interest in scholarship and science, a deep commitment to the environment, her profound understanding of cultural diversity of India. So in that sense, yes. But Indira Gandhi had total control over the whole country. Apart from Tamil Nadu, the Congress party was dominant everywhere. So federalism may save us from the worst of Narendra Modi. So even if Narendra Modi's intentions may not be at all democratic, just as Indira Gandhi's were not, you cannot see Narendra Modi doing what Indira Gandhi did, which is to say, I was awful to have imposed the emergency. I'm going to call elections, and that's the only thing I'm not going to tell Sanjay Gandhi about, because he will overrule me, right? So you can't say. I think federalism, our hope today is federalism. I've written a column that has just come up in ndtv.com, which says, Kerala model yes, Gujarat model no. And it's not only about tackling COVID, Abhinandan. It's about gender equality, transparency, decentralization. So if the states can show us a different kind of way, then I think we can be saved from the worst.
All right. I hope you're right. And I hope we get past this and we can sit opposite each other and have our next interview.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Until then, stay indoors, stay safe. Thank you for your time and thank you for your writing.
Enjoyed it very much.